crooked. There we go. Still a little crooked. Fix it. There we go. This is the Unhitching Hour, how the law works when your relationship doesn't. My name is Reed Aronson. I am a divorce lawyer here in New York City. And the purpose of this show is to talk to people about what their rights are and what their lives look like if they're having a major life change, a divorce, a custody fight, anything like that. So that if you or your friends are going through one of those big life changes, you can be in a position to maybe understand a little bit better of what's going to go on in a judge's mind or what's going to happen when your lawyers are fighting it out, that sort of thing. So thank you for joining us. Like I said, this is episode 12. As you'll notice, this episode is going to be a little bit different. We don't have my lovely co-host, Vanessa. As many of you probably know, last week we had our first child. His name is Lavari. He is very cute. So Vanessa is taking the week off to help care for him while I'm doing this. And I'm flying solo this week. So the format is going to be a little bit different. Rather than doing the sort of question and answer response, we're just going to talk a little bit about a case that was in the news this week. And that case, let me share screen, is this one. So this is a case. The case is Dr. Dre versus, or I guess Nicole Young versus Dr. Dre, and that's not his real name. Dr. Dre, whose real name is Andre Young, is a rapper. He came to prominence in the late 80s, early 90s with the group NWA. He then went on to have a solo career, The Chronic, then became a big producer of rap and hip hop, and was very successful in that. And then he went, many of you, those of you who don't know much about rap, may have heard of his line of headphones called Beats by Dre. And Beats by Dre sold to Apple for a huge amount of money. So Dr. Dre is a very, very wealthy man. He's been married to his wife, Nicole, since the mid-90s. So she's been around for not the entire ride, but for a big chunk of it. And she's the headline that sort of, called people to attention was the one that we're looking at. This is from People magazine. You can't quite tell it from the image that I have, but that she is asking for $2 million a month in temporary spousal support. So that was the big thing that hit the headlines. But the first thing that I'd like to talk about actually with this, before I'll talk about, I promise, the $2 million a month in a bit. But first, I'd like to talk about the prenuptial agreement. And we'll talk about that a little because we've talked about that on a previous episode about prenuptial agreements. But apparently, Dr. Dre and his wife, before they got married, signed a prenuptial agreement, which is not terribly surprising given that at the time they got married, he was already, a very successful musician. I don't know exactly how wealthy he was at that point, but he was certainly, famous. He had, multiple very well-selling albums at that point, both as NWA and as a solo artist. And she claims, here we go. So she claims that before our wedding date, Andre demanded that I sign a premarital agreement that 16 of his lawyers had drafted. And that at the time he was well known, but he had not reached the pinnacle. And he told me that I must sign a premarital agreement or he would not marry me. I was extremely reluctant, resistant, and afraid to sign the agreement and felt backed into a corner. She was left with no option but to sign the prenup unwillingly shortly before their wedding in 1996 because of the, quote, extraordinary pressure and intimidation by Andre. And then she goes on to say some other things, but first let's talk about that, and I'm going to leave it here so that you guys can watch it, and so that way I'm not the only thing on screen. So when we talked about prenuptial agreements, we talked about that a little bit ago, both in New York and in California, which is where they are. I think they're in Los Angeles. Prenuptial agreements are like contracts. They're treated like contracts. And just as in any contract, no matter what contract you might sign, you're always going to say, you could always argue, right? I had to sign it. I had no choice because if I didn't sign the contract, I wouldn't get the thing that I wanted that the person would only give me if I signed the contract, right? If I buy a house, I can't buy a house unless I sign a contract saying I will pay the person who owns the house the amount of money that they're asking for, right? I won't get the house. That doesn't give me a reason to invalidate a contract that I signed. Right? It doesn't give me a justification to say, well, this contract shouldn't count because I couldn't, because I really wanted that house. I desperately wanted that house. I needed that house, and they wouldn't sell me the house if I didn't sign this contract. So therefore, I only want to pay half of what I said I would in the contract, or I don't want to pay anything, but I want to keep the contract anyway. That's not how it works, and that's not how it works with prenuptial agreements either. Now, look, we're of course just looking at a People magazine article. There's not necessarily you're not necessarily talking about all of the facts that you might bring up, but just saying, well, he wouldn't have signed it if I didn't agree, or he wouldn't have married me, excuse me, if I didn't sign the prenup, is probably not going to be enough to get her out of the prenup she signed. Because again, you have to be looking at this from the perspective of, from that perspective. Second, she says, hold on. However, so moving on. Young said that Dre acknowledged to me that he felt ashamed he had pressured me into signing a premarital agreement, and he tore up multiple copies of the agreement in front of me about 2 to 3 years into their marriage. Since the day he tore up the agreements, we both understood that there was no premarital agreement and that it was null and void, she said in her declaration. So this is a thing that comes up, maybe not in this exact context, but in times similar to this, somewhat often, where somebody says, he promised me or she promised me that if we were together long enough, or we had kids, or even just, at some random time after, that she didn't want to have the prenup, or he didn't want to have the prenup anymore. He felt bad about it. He didn't think it was fair. And so he was ripping it up, and it didn't count anymore. And look, I haven't done case research. Maybe there's cases in California, but in New York, I can tell you that would not fly. There's almost any prenuptial agreement that anybody's going to sign, and in fact, most agreements that people sign of any kind, there's going to be something called a modification provision. And what a modification provision will say, generally, is something along the lines of, no modification of this agreement can be made unless it's made in the same formality, which usually means in writing, signed by notaries in addition to the parties, the same formality that this agreement was signed in. I can tell you every prenup I have done, as far as I can remember, says that. And most prenups that I have reviewed have something like that. And what does that mean? What that means is that no matter what I'm telling you with my mouth, right, unless I sign on the dotted line and get it notarized, it doesn't matter. The act of tearing it up. Now, by the way, there's some notion in wills. I remember from law school, I don't deal with wills now, but I remember with wills in law school, there's something about if you tear up a will, it somehow goes in prenuptial agreements. That's not the case. Just because I say, I make a big dramatic gesture of, well, I don't want this anymore. I'm tearing it up. I'm throwing it into the flames. I'm calling my lawyer and telling him, delete every copy of this that you have. That doesn't matter, because there's an agreement, and the agreement says this agreement can only be changed or eliminated if we both sign it. And if you think about it, there's a good reason for that, even as just a general practice, right? First of all, when you have an agreement, you don't want to then have a trial about who said what when, right? The purpose of an agreement, of a written agreement, is so that I can show it to the judge and I can say, Judge, this is what we agreed to. These are the terms. This is what's happening. And we don't have to then worry about who said what to whom outside the four corners of this document. But if we're going to allow things like agreements to be changed or eliminated based on what somebody says the other party says, over the course of these two were married for almost 25 years. I'm sure they said a lot of things. I'm sure maybe he promised her at one point, well, he promised me that he'd give me $1 million just because I was very nice to him. So he should have to do that. Or he promised me that he would increase my percentage, or he promised me that he would pay me more in support, or anything, right? If you're able to change the deal just verbally, you're going to have then days and days of trial, trying to then suss out who said what and did they really mean it. And also, from this perspective, she's also a party to this agreement, right? And while now looking back on it, she doesn't like the terms of it and she'd rather be out of it. At some level, every agreement has consideration going in both directions, right? That, like in the house example, right? I buy a house, I pay the person money, and in exchange, I get a house. And that's the deal we made. And if one party can just say, well, I'm tearing this up, and it doesn't matter anymore, it's out the window. Now you have a situation where the party who didn't tear it up all of a sudden doesn't have an agreement anymore. Why would one party be able, with their actions, however forceful and evocative of something dramatic that was, why would that person be able to just tear up an agreement? Doesn't make sense. So looking at this, I'm looking at a People magazine article. I think that she will have a tough hill to climb to get rid of this prenuptial agreement that they signed, and that she seems to acknowledge that she signed and agreed to. The 16 lawyers notwithstanding, I do find it interesting, the notion that there would be 16 lawyers who worked on a prenuptial agreement. That's certainly never been my experience. But I guess if you're Dr. Dre, maybe Dre has a lot of people in working for him to do a prenuptial agreement. Okay, so now the other thing in this article, which is again the $2 million in temporary spousal support. So what is temporary spousal support? It's what it sounds like, right? You're getting divorced. You're not necessarily living together while you're getting divorced. Maybe you are, but maybe you're not. And now, because we're getting divorced, normally when two people are married, they're maybe sharing expenses. They're paying each other's, the person who's earning the money is giving the person who's not earning the money cash to pay for their food, to pay for their housing, to pay for clothing, to pay for whatever their expenses are, right? That's part of the marital deal. But now that they're getting divorced, maybe, the person who's making the money says, well, why am I going to give my soon-to-be ex-wife or my soon-to-be ex-husband money every month? I don't want to do that. But you have to, right? Because that person still needs to live. That person, especially on a temporary basis, because, she might be entitled to some payout when they get divorced. But if she doesn't have that money yet, she has no means to support herself. She has no way of feeding herself, of clothing herself, of housing herself. So obviously, you're going to need at some level. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I have trouble working the technology. I'm doing my best here, but you're going to you're going to need that money on an ongoing basis. You're not going to be able to live without money going forward. So during the pendency of the divorce, temporary, right? During the pendency of the divorce, you can go to court and say, I need some money during the pendency of the divorce while we're figuring this out to pay for myself, to pay for my housing, to do all of that. So that's what Nicole Young did. And what she asked for was $2 million a month. And from some other articles I have gleaned that she gets to that number. She calculates that number. She includes $135,000 a month in clothing, $60,000 a month in education expenses, $900,000 a month in entertainment, $10,000 a month in laundry and cleaning, $125,000 a month in charitable contributions, $100,000 a month for her mortgage, and $10,000 a month for her cell phone, telephone, email, those sorts of things. So those numbers are very, very big. But on the other hand, Dr. Dre obviously is a very, very wealthy man. I don't remember the exact number, but Beats sold to Apple for billions of dollars with a B. And that's in addition to all of the money that he's made in music, but I imagine most of that is, just the amount of money that he made on that deal is probably astronomical. And he seems to have, I don't know for certain, but he seems to have a pretty good sense for business. So my guess is that he's used that money, he's made that money work for him. So he probably earns a decent amount of money. He's got a decent amount of money in the bank. more than decent. And the question is, how much is she entitled to? So I guess the question that maybe I will talk about is, let's say that she proves out all of those expenses, right? She proves out that's how much money she earns every day. Not every day, but that's how much money she spends. That's her actual budget. She's not just inflating numbers because she wants cash. This is how much she spends. She went through her credit card records. She went through her receipts. She did all that. She calculated it down to the penny. And this is the amount of money that she needs to continue to pay for the things that she has historically paid for using his money. Does she get it? Is she entitled to it? So, remember we talked 2 weeks ago about child support and how in New York, child support is based on a formula, which is a percentage of one party's income compared to a percentage of the other party's income. Spousal support, temporary spousal support in particular, works vaguely, pretty much the same way. The formula is different and it's complicated, so I don't want, there's a lot of if this, then that, percentages compared to each other. So I don't want to get too deep into it right now because I'm trying to keep the podcast short, or the cast short today. But it's similar. And in California, in fact, they have one too for temporary support. And it is 40% of the payor's income, so that would be Dre, minus 50% of the payee's income. In this case, my guess is, I don't know, but I don't think Nicole Young probably has anything like her husband's income. So let's assume hers is zero. He makes a tremendous amount. So I don't know if he makes, what she would be talking about for 40% of his income. If she wants $2 million, 40% of his income, that's what, $5 million, right? So he makes $5 million a month in income. That's about what their guidelines say. Now, their guidelines are also, like in New York, just guidelines, and they can depart from it. And one of the things that you'll hear about sort of in popular culture, or the general notion of what people are entitled to, right? You hear the concept of, you hear about the concept of, and let me close out of this. You hear about the concept of the lifestyle to which she has become accustomed, right? A lifestyle to which she has become accustomed. And we talk a lot about, in our cases, about lifestyle. What was their lifestyle? And that is an important factor when you're deciding how much support somebody should get, right? It's not just sort of this raw calculation, but it's also really, how did they live? What did they do? How did they live? What did they do? How did that go on? And so that is an important factor, and that's sort of what she is clearly arguing about. But that's not the only factor. And also, when you're looking at a lifestyle analysis like this, it's not just what did they spend, but it's also what's a reasonable amount to be spending going forward. What are the things that she really needs? What is the amount of money she really needs to maintain what looks like the lifestyle? And when you look at the list of things that she includes, for example, her mortgage, right? She was living in a house. They were living in a house. She needs to continue to, she's gonna have to continue to pay a mortgage. That seems like something that's sort of dead bang center of what we think about when we're talking about reasonable needs and lifestyle, and the reasonable lifestyle going forward is a mortgage, right? This is my housing costs. Food, which is not on the list that I gave you, but that sort of thing. What kind of restaurants did she get to eat at? What kind of life did she live in that way? On the other hand, $900,000 in entertainment expenses. What does that mean, right? Does she really need $900,000 a month to entertain herself? Or was that really just like, well, she and Dre lived together, and they, he probably threw elaborate parties, partly for his business, partly for other things. There are, I guess what I'm driving at here is there are benefits of being married to somebody who is incredibly wealthy. There are benefits to that. There's travel. There's fancy parties that you get to go to. There's dining out that you get to do. There's charitable donations and charitable giving and things like that you get to be a part of as a consequence of being married to somebody who's very, very wealthy. as far as I am aware in California, and as I know in New York, there's no entitlement to be able to continue all of those things going forward after you're divorced from that person. That, you don't necessarily get to continue to donate $125,000 a month to charity, even if that's something that you did, even if that is definitely part of your lifestyle before you got divorced. You're not necessarily going to get to do that afterwards. You're not necessarily going to get to go out to the fancy parties that you went to, or have the fancy, at the fancy restaurants every night that you did as a friend. You might not be able to do this, enjoy the same kind of travel. Now, if we're talking about housing, if we're talking about basic needs, yeah, you're going to get enough money to cover those. But what you're not going to be able to do is say, like, well, every nickel that I spent while I was married to him, or every nickel that he spent on me, I want now again. That's just not the way it works. Even with somebody, in my view, who is as wealthy as Dr. Dre, and look, a California judge will decide, and maybe a California judge will look at it differently under California law and all of that. And obviously, I would defer to a California lawyer as to how it might turn out. But generally, I know in New York, and I believe also in California, it's not just here's what I spent and here's what I'm going to spend going forward. It's what do you really need? What do you really need to keep some semblance of how you lived, and understanding that you're not going to get to necessarily have all of the benefits, all of the wonderful things that you enjoyed as a result of being married to somebody who is as wealthy as Dr. Dre. All right, so that was a little bit about prenups and a little bit about spousal support, temporary spousal support. Thank you all for coming back. It was, we missed last week because we were in the hospital with little Lavari, but it's I'm glad to be getting back in the swing of things. Hopefully, either Vanessa or maybe another guest host will join me next week. In any event, this has been the Unhitching Hour, how the law works when your relationship doesn't. My name is Reed Aronson. Please, if you have a chance, go visit our YouTube page. We've just posted episodes 10 and 11 on there. We try and get our episodes up once a week. Thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions or topics for future shows, please don't hesitate to write us at unhitchinghour@gmail.com. We'll answer your questions or requests if there's something you didn't want to ask on Facebook Live. And that is our show for today. I hope everybody had a good time. I hope everybody's enjoying the last vestiges of summer. And we'll see you next week. Bye.